Russia's Petro-Politics, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Robert Ricigliano, Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM. As the resurgent Russia seeks to expand its influence over its neighbors, concern is mounting over what has become an increasingly coercive energy policy. With energy security near the top of many nations' list of strategic priorities, governments throughout Europe and beyond are seeking a response to Russia's potential role as a petro-bully. To help us explore how Moscow is shaping the global energy market and examine the potential strategic threat represented by Russia's energy policy, we're joined in the studio by John Katzka, a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer who has conducted public diplomacy for the Department of State on 4 continents, including service in Moscow, and Stephen Isaacson, an institutional stockbroker with B.C. Ziegler Company. We'll also be joined by phone from Washington, D.C. by Clifford Gaddy, an economist specializing in Russia at the Brookings Institute. He's the author, with Barry Ickes, of the forthcoming book, Russia's Addiction, The Political Economy of Resource Dependence. Welcome to International Focus. Clifford, I wonder if we can start with you. I'd like to have you set a bit of a context for us. The images that people see in terms of the Russia-Georgia confrontation are the more dramatic ones, the movement of troops and tanks and refugees. But there are many, many issues behind this story, and one of them is Russia's role as an oil and gas supplier to Eastern and Western Europe. I'm wondering if you could give us a little bit of context on what Russia's role as an oil and gas supplier means. What does it entail?
Well, let's just look at some of the figures. The basic picture is that Western Europe, Eastern Europe, which we used to call Eastern Europe, Central Europe, is heavily dependent on Russia as its primary supplier of energy. Look at the EU 27, the expanded new European Union. 45% roughly of its oil consumption comes from Russian oil. 30% of its natural gas consumption is supplied by Russia. That's an average for the entire European Union. There are countries among them that are 100% dependent, for instance, on Russian natural gas. So there's this heavy dependence that has caused, and especially after some episodes of diminished supplies in connection with the Ukrainian crisis and a couple of winters ago, it has caused people to be very concerned that Russia might have the power to cut these countries off from oil or gas and therefore impose political conditions, whatever people hypothesize that Russia might attempt to do. It's interesting because, in fact, I would say among most Europeans, this is what I just described is a common sentiment or a common view of many American policymakers. Actually, among many Europeans, if not most European policymakers, the real concern is not that the Russians might intentionally cut off supply for political purposes, but rather that Russia itself cannot maintain the level of supply that would be needed to export at the levels it has committed itself to do by contract, and at the same time supply its own domestic economy, which is growing with the energy needs that it has there. So, in other words, not that Russia might intentionally cut off the energy, but that it might be forced to because it's not maintaining supply. Either way you look at it, and there may be elements of both in reality, there's no question that Europeans in particular have to be almost obsessed with the situation with Russia's production of oil and gas and its transportation of those commodities.
So those that would say that it's Europe's dependence on Russian oil and gas has muted its response to its invasion of Georgia, you're saying basically those two aren't linked. So in other words, yes, they see an interdependence with Russia over its supply of energy, but it's not necessarily meaning that they're going to treat them with kid gloves when it comes to political and military issues.
Well, I think there's no question that if one wants to describe the European response as muted, of course that's been influenced by their energy relationship with Russia, their general economic relationship, by the way. They export a huge amount of other goods to the Russians in return for the oil and gas they receive. They're heavily economic interdependent, and I think we can assume that there's always an element of not just jumping to hot rhetoric or to other actions, rather trying to figure out how we can maintain the relationship. So, this is, I think, a general principle that we can apply. However, what I think is there's really, in both cases, whether one believes that Russia might intentionally cut off the energy or whether one believes that Russia might fall short in its ability to supply energy, both attitudes lead Europeans to think seriously about how they can work together with the Russians to avoid either one of those outcomes. In the latter outcome, the eventuality that Russia might not be able to keep up its supply, of course, you have to ask what could possibly the Europeans do to help the Russians on that front. Well, obviously, invest themselves. Would they be allowed to invest in European energy resources to increase production? And that raises some interesting questions about the Russians' attitude towards foreign investment in their energy sector right now, which is a bit dicey.
John, did you have a question?
Well, I was just going to make a comment that, and you said it earlier, about the level of dependence of the various European countries, and so that if you're in Britain or in France, your level of dependence on Russian energy is lower than, say, for Germany, and you can see that in the way in which the various countries talk to the issue of the Georgian intervention.
And so But I guess you're seeing a competing school of thought here, though, which is that the responses to the Russian incursion that are heavy-handed and military and confrontational, I'm hearing from what you're saying, Clifford, that are from a long-term perspective less productive if you're looking at this relationship as sort of very intertwined.
Well, exactly, but I certainly would agree that you can find a correlation between and it's whether you call it dependence or interrelationship with the Russians economically in general or dependence on their energy, tends to be correlated with some of the responses to, for instance, this so far unique application of real military hard power that the Russians have used on a neighboring country, as opposed to the use of so-called soft power, of which I guess we would consider energy supplies to be an example. If you're not as closely interlinked with Russia and mutually interdependent with Russia, there is more leeway to quote, be tough on Russia on a circumstance like this. For the other countries, they may be equally concerned about what's been happening with Georgia, but they also have to think about the long-term relationship, and perhaps it's a matter of different means to the same end. They have to think more in the long term, and obviously have to be cautious about causing short-term crisis in the relationship.
Clifford, the title of your book seems to indicate, Russia may be becoming unhelpfully addicted to its position as an oil gas supplier. What has Russia done to invest in its economic infrastructure separate from the energy sector?
Not very much, and this is a big concern even of the current Russian leadership. They are caught in a real dilemma. As I indicated from the beginning, an immediate concern, not only for the outside world, but also for Russian policymakers themselves, is the declining production of oil and gas. Oil is actually has negative growth. It's declining at the moment. Gas is very, very modest increases. These both have to be measured against their commitments to deliver oil and gas internally and externally. So they need to invest more in their oil and gas sector. At the same time, they're well aware, as anyone is, that over-dependence on oil and gas, commodities whose price fluctuates greatly on the world markets over the long term and even in the short term, as we've seen this summer, this exposes your entire economy to a big risk when you're as heavily dependent as Russia is. So you would like to diversify away from oil and gas. But there we've got a fundamental contradiction. Every ruble that Russia needs to invest in oil and gas in order to maintain its production levels is one less ruble that can be invested in other areas of their economy to diversify for the future. They are really caught in a bind. They have certainly achieved a level of recovery from their economic depression of the 1990s in a spectacular way, thanks to the very high world prices of oil and gas. So their current prosperity, their current strength, their assertiveness and self-confidence is almost exclusively due to these high oil and gas prices. But as I say, looking to the future, they must be extremely nervous. And of course, even these past 2-3 months experience, world oil prices hit their peak in mid-July. They're now down by 30% from what they were in mid-July. This impacts the Russian economy immediately. The Russian stock market is down also by 30% during the same period. That's because it's so highly tied up with oil and gas.
And you mentioned, this kind of brings us back to the foreign investment issue. If you know, petrodollars are being pulled in a couple of directions in terms of investment in the Russian economy, it would seem to indicate that they're going to need foreign investment to do this. Can you expand a little bit more on what the prospects for that investment are, both on the side of the investors and on the side of the Russians?
Okay. First of all, as I indicated, Russian oil and gas production are relatively flat right now. Many people have suggested that's evidence of the so-called peak oil hypothesis globally, that we're running out of oil everywhere. I disagree with that strongly. I think there's no question Russia has huge quantities of oil and gas left on that vast territory. It's still territorially the biggest country in the world. There are great regions that haven't even been explored. The question is that it's very expensive oil and gas. That is, it is located in very remote regions with no infrastructure development at all. Very cold regions would require a great deal of investment technology, not just in the actual drilling, but in building the infrastructure. And so therefore, and this is also kind of a discrete step that has to be taken. That is, up until now, even in this current recovery, Russia has been able to take advantage of the so-called legacy development that had been made during the Soviet period, big investments in the oil and gas industry in the 1970s and 1980s. A lot of that just sort of lay dormant during the 1990s, during the General Depression. Now, if it's going to notably, significantly increase its oil and gas production for the future, it's going to have to venture out into these completely new, very remote areas. And that's going to mean you can't just go out and drill one extra well, for instance. You're going to have to make a big, huge investment. If you're going to do that, I mean, I think it is very clear that you're going to have international involvement. You're going to have, again, companies like ExxonMobil, like Shell, like BP, and so forth, French companies, and so on. And right now, the Russians have been moving, if anything, in the opposite direction. They've been putting the squeeze on the international companies that are present in Russia, still are, and therefore not acting very encouragingly to bring in other companies or to get these current companies to invest more. So something has got to change, and probably change quite quickly in that regard, if Russia is going to maintain its current levels of production.
And again, I think that brings us back around to the potential response now to the Russian incursion into Georgia. Clifford Gaddy from the Brookings Institute, thank you very much for helping us get insight into Russia's role as a petro player, and also remind our viewers to look for your book, Russia's Addiction, in the bookstores. So, Clifford Gaddy, thank you again.
Mm-hmm.
We'll be back in just a moment, International Focus, after a short break.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. We're talking about Russia's role as a potential petro-bully. I want to come back to our in-studio guest. We just heard from Clifford Gaddy from the Brookings Institute. And Stephen, maybe I thought to start with you just some thoughts and reflections on what you heard Clifford Gaddy say.
Well, I think starting with markets, which is something that I tend to look at once in a while, there's a key index called the RTS index, which measures the amount of investment in the Russian stock system by U.S. or investors in dollars. And the minute that the Soviets, or not the Soviets, but the Russians invaded,
not quite there yet.
Not quite there yet. When the Russians invaded Georgia, I think on August 8th, the balloon just popped. I mean, the index fell by 50%, which could signal an exit from the Russian stock market by outside investors. It's showing a lack of confidence in whether private investments have much of a future in Russia. I thought that was an interesting observation that appeared suddenly on the world stage. And then the other question I have, and I don't have the answer to this, it's just something I've thought about, is when the Warsaw Pact blew apart back in the late 80s, one of the things that you heard is that Russia had notified its trading partners, principally East Germany, that we're not going to be able to supply you with gas for the winter. And therefore, you're going to have to go out and get your own gas, which means you're going to have to start trading for hard currency. And what do we do now? And that led to a rapid number of reforms that ultimately wound up in the wall coming down. So I just wonder if anybody has a thought about that.
John?
Well, I think those were that resulted in the renegotiation of contracts between the Warsaw Pact countries, or the former Warsaw Pact countries, and Soviet Union / Russia. And they were at very different rates than they were enjoying before the wall came down.
But is there an analog, though, in the current situation? Because you have a lot of those same countries, Ukraine and others, who are heavily dependent upon Russian gas and oil, who are also now feeling we could be the next, Georgia, the next target for an invasion potentially. Is there a move now to get them to diversify away from them again?
Diversify to where? I mean, I think that's the big question. The Ukraine experience for Western Europe was several years ago. What we didn't talk about was what they had done in the meantime to diversify their needs. Partly it's a question of access and distance, and it's also a question of cost and alternatives. Everyone is scrounging the world right now looking for that gas, the Chinese more so than anyone else. So finding it elsewhere is going to be very difficult.
Well, it kind of locks us back into one of the things that Clifford Gaddy was talking about, of this sort of indispensable, mutually dependent relationship here, where you kind of can't live with them, can't live without them, I guess. You need the gas and the oil, but on the other hand, you have flare-ups like in Georgia and concerns that Russia will begin to exert itself in other ways. Looking at this from an economic, if the basis for that concern is sort of the economic resurgence of Russia, Steve, how deep do you see that economic platform that Russia's supposedly asserting itself from?
Well, I think that Clifford said something really interesting. He said that they still have not devoted, a whole lot of dollars to infrastructure. I'm not sure that the average Russian is really enjoying, a tremendously higher standard of living than what they had 3 years ago or 4 years ago, at a time when, the reserves have been building up. Moscow, they say, is the most expensive city in the world to live in. Is that because there's a huge security premium for your safety or for the safety of businesses operating there? I've never been there, so I don't know. But from an economic standpoint, it seems to me that they're still trying to tap the low-hanging fruit and getting oil out of the ground. They have spent very little money on infrastructure. They're not putting a lot of people to work that weren't working before in these areas. And then the question is, okay, what do you do with the reserves? Well, are you pouring them into the military so that the next Chechenian adventure will be one backed up by muscle and not a bunch of old tanks? So I don't know, and I think it's a good question.
So, John, if you're in the Secretary of State's, you ran the policy planning group for the Department of State, and you looked strategically at what might Russia's role be into the future. Looking at this Georgian event, how much can you extrapolate away and say, hey, it's going to get worse? Or are you taking some of Steve's and Clifford's comments about the potential weakness in that economy to think, long term, we're not sure how big a threat this is?
I think we have to put a different headset on. When we look at Russia, we don't talk about economics and wealth and individual gratification as being important things. We have to turn that all just on its head. We're talking about power. We're talking about political action, and those resources are not to build a better life for every Russian citizen. Those are vehicles that allow the Russian state to again assert itself and take on its proper role in the world. And you would be surprised to find how many Russians buy into that, because again, there is no historical place for the individual or for market economics in Russian history.
They're not expecting a Russian version of the New Deal.
In fact,
out of this.
they're finding a great deal of satisfaction in the way in which their society is being at least respected, possibly feared in the world. These are all things that make a Russian stand a little taller.
And Steve, you mentioned about Moscow being the most expensive city in the world, and I saw you sort of agreeing with that, John. So what's your read on why? What is behind that? I mean, is this a sign of?
Well, it is not a free market economy. Therefore, the number of players that are providing the supply are limited, and therefore, and the number of buyers. The people who need these places, like my son-in-law who lives there, who they have to go wherever and pay whatever the market, whatever they want.
That's another insight, I think, in the Russian economy, which is it may not behave like a wide open free economy might. Right. It's more of an oligarchic, controlled by central forces.
It's a centrally controlled political power, which has some economic interests.
Yeah, it may not be absolutely the Jeffersonian model, and it's not the rule of law. I mean, even though they have police and judges, I mean, all of that is still murky to me as to what the process is. One of the things that we have seen, since the days of Yeltsin, when they literally gave away all of the state-owned businesses to the people, and then they were bought back for pittances in the street because people needed to eat, and the oligarchs wind up with control. That's now moving the other way. Russia clearly is exercising censorship. They've shut down the organs of public dissent. They're taking more control of the main sources of energy. The big question is, how long does British Petroleum survive with TMK? They're getting a lot of problems from the government, and it just seems like the same old coming up again.
It's not the Soviet Union, though. I mean, this is a different animal. And remember, those organs of public information that we're talking about were avenues for the oligarchs to be able to get their point across.
If we look at, we've got just a few minutes left. I want to look to, what does this all tell us about potential responses from whether it's the United States or it's Europe vis-a-vis Russia now? So is it to start the Cold War again, essentially, and make a very strong, hard, sort of military-based response? Is it to constructively engage with them, whether it's in foreign investment or other trade policies? What's the future hold for policy?
Well, I think, first of all, we're going to have to back off a little bit in terms of the rhetoric. I mean, this is the election time, and therefore candidates have to outdo each other in terms of talking tough. We have to do a reassessment on the basis of a resurgent Russia. Russia is going to, not dissimilar from our own Monroe Doctrine, take a strong interest in the countries around it. We continue to do that. We went into Panama over those kinds of issues. So we should understand that great powers take these kinds of positions. It doesn't make it right or wrong, it just makes it there. Go ahead.
I was going to say that there's a lot of nerves, because if you take a look at a place like Belarus, there are a lot of pipelines that come out of the Caspian that crisscross through there that are owned by other interests, and that would have a major effect if the Russians were to exert some muscle with Belarus or on those pipelines, the supply into the EU. I think that there has been a lot of talk about Algeria. We saw Condoleezza Rice go down there to talk to Gaddafi. Well, they have unbelievable natural gas reserves that could be tapped and could be an alternative to Russian energy, and we have to see how that plays out with new friends.
There's an interesting development happening right now. The OPEC is meeting, And the Russians have come and have been expressed an interest in joining with OPEC. Right. And how they are going to connect up with the Saudis. Now, the Saudis would like this from an economic standpoint because together they would control the significant amount of oil. But on the other hand, the Saudis have very little interest in what Russia wants to do. But Russia now, with that $600 billion in reserves, is pushing its agenda further and further out.
We have just a few seconds left. I guess this is sort of agree or disagree. Just as this is not the Soviet Union, it also feels like this is not the Cold War either in terms of how the West and the U.S. should deal with Russia. I
think we need to lay down markers to Russia. We need to do them carefully. We need to recognize that we need them for various things. But we need to lay down markers so that if they sort of go past a point, and
we've got a response. Great. John Katzka and Stephen Isaacson, thank you for lending your voices to this. Also to Clifford Gaddy for joining us from Washington. To our viewers, we'll see you next week on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website.